Welcome, dear listeners, to a story that peels back the polished veneer of privilege to reveal the raw, often brutal mechanics of power. This isn't just a tale of a schoolyard bully and his victim. It's a deep dive into the unseen forces that shape our lives. The quiet battles fought not with fists, but with understanding, and the profound realization that true strength often lies in what remains unsaid. So settle in perhaps on your commute, or as you wind down for the night, because what you're about to hear might just change how you look at every challenge you face. Our stage is set at Sterling Prep Academy. Now don't picture your average high school. Sterling wasn't merely an institution of learning. It was a kingdom. Imagine gleaming marble floors that reflected the sunlight like a perfectly cut diamond, manicured lawns that stretched seemingly forever, whispering secrets of generations of old money, and ivy-covered walls that seemed to hum with the unspoken rules of a deeply entrenched elite. Every whispered conversation in the hallowed halls, every perfectly tailored blazer, every polished shoe screamed of legacy of privilege and of an undeniable sense of entitlement that seeped into the very air you breathed. It was a place where connections mattered more than curriculum, where surnames echoed with more weight than any academic achievement, and where the hierarchy was as rigid and unyielding as the ancient oak trees dotting the campus. At the very apex of this meticulously constructed kingdom sat Brandon Thorne. He wasn't just the captain of the football team, he was the undisputed king of Sterling Prep. Picture him a tall, athletic build, a perfectly coiffed head of sandy blonde hair, and eyes that held a chilling blend of charm and casual disdain. Brandon's dominance wasn't overtly aggressive. It was a subtle, insidious art form. He didn't need to shout to be obeyed. His power lay in the dismissive glance that could crush a lesser student's spirit, the cutting remark disguised as a joke that left its victim silently bleeding, the effortless manipulation of teachers and peers who consciously or unconsciously bowed to his family's influence. I remember hearing about a moment just weeks before our story begins when a timid new kid, desperately trying to make an impression, was giving a presentation in front of the class. Brandon from the back row simply yawned a silent, exaggerated gesture. The entire class chuckled. The teacher, usually stern, merely offered a weak smile. The new kid stammered, lost his train of thought, and ultimately failed the assignment. No one could pinpoint what Brandon did, but everyone knew he was responsible. It was this untouchable aura that made Brandon Thorne so formidable. He had never faced a genuine challenge, never encountered a consequence he couldn't deflect, and certainly never met anyone who refused to play by his rules. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a new shadow fell upon the kingdom of Sterling Prep. His name was Elijah Hayes. Elijah was different. Immediately, he stood out in the sea of blondes and brunettes with his quiet confidence, his unassuming demeanor, and the rich, warm tone of his skin. He moved with a distinct grace, not awkward or unsure, but almost gliding, as if he possessed an internal compass that always pointed true north, impervious to the social pressures and gravitational pull of Sterling Prep's established hierarchy. While other new students would frantically try to assimilate Elijah, simply focused on his academics, his quiet focus, a stark contrast to the frantic social climbing around him. He didn't try to fit in, he just was. And in a place obsessed with outward appearances and social maneuvering, Elijah's very presence was an anomaly. Little did Brandon Thorne know, his carefully constructed kingdom, built on the fragile foundation of fear and perceived power, was about to meet its quiet challenger. And Elijah, accustomed to navigating unseen currents and understanding the true weight of unspoken words, possessed a comprehension of genuine power that Brandon, in all his gilded privilege, could never ever comprehend. He'd seen kings fall, not with a roar, but with a whisper. He'd witnessed empires crumble not from a direct assault, but from a gradual, insidious erosion. He was in essence a quiet storm brewing on the horizon, unnoticed by those too busy basking in their own manufactured sunlight. And for Brandon Thorne, accustomed to the predictable dance of dominance and submission, this silence, this calm, this utterly unreadable new kid was the first tremor of an earthquake he wouldn't see coming. Elijah's background, while not explicitly known to the Sterling Prep elite, had forged his unique resilience. He hadn't come from the same sprawling estates or legacy families. He'd transferred from a different world, one where the fights weren't always visible and the insults weren't always shouted. He'd faced his share of microaggressions, the subtle dismissals, the assumptions based on his race before. These experiences hadn't broken him. They had refined him. His calm demeanor wasn't naivete or timidity. It was a learned defense mechanism, a quiet strength and a profound understanding that some battles are best fought by refusing to engage on your opponent's terms. It was a strategy, a calculated absence of reaction that would prove to be Brandon Thorne's undoing. Brandon, of course, began his usual testing phase, the casual, accidental shoulder bumps in the crowded hallways that were anything but accidental, the whispered jokes with his clique about diversity quotas, or affirmative action hires in Elijah's earshot. Brandon expected a furious glance, a retort, a flinch, any reaction. But Elijah would just keep walking as if Brandon didn't exist, his face a perfect mask of serene indifference. This infuriated Brandon more than any angry comeback ever could. He was used to victims who screamed, or at least whimpered. Elijah gave him nothing. This, my friends, was the first subtle twist in our narrative. The lack of engagement became the first and most powerful countermove. It was as if Brandon was a fire that needed oxygen to burn, and Elijah was steadily, calmly cutting off his air supply. And Brandon, blinded by his own arrogance, didn't even realize he was slowly suffocating. He just knew he was getting angrier. This quiet, unyielding defiance from Elijah, this refusal to play the victim, set the stage for an escalation. Brandon Thorne, the self-proclaimed king, found himself in unfamiliar territory. His usual tactics, which had always produced immediate and gratifying results, were now met with a wall of serene indifference. This wasn't just frustrating, it was unnerving. Every non-reaction from Elijah felt like a personal insult, a challenge to Brandon's very identity as the dominant force in Sterling Prep. He needed a reaction. He craved it, and that desperate need would lead him to make a colossal mistake. One that would unravel his carefully constructed kingdom from the inside out. The stage is now set for a confrontation that will not just be about a spilled lunch tray, but about the fundamental nature of power itself. The calm, the silence, the sheer unreadability of Elijah Hayes was a poison seeping into Brandon Thorne's carefully constructed world. His usual playbook, the one that guaranteed instant submission and fed his voracious ego, was utterly useless against this new kid. Brandon's frustration wasn't just growing. It was festering, turning into a raw, angry itch that only a dramatic display of power could scratch. He needed a reaction from Elijah. He craved it. It was like trying to punch a ghost. His blows went right through, leaving him feeling foolish and impotent, a sensation utterly alien to the king of Sterling Prep. He started subtly trying to bait Elijah. In the crowded hallways, the accidental shoulder bumps became more frequent, more forceful. Brandon would orchestrate these encounters, ensuring his friends were watching a smirk playing on his lips, fully expecting a furious glance, a muttered retort, or at the very least, a moment of visible discomfort. But Elijah would just keep walking, his hands often in his pockets, his gaze steady, as if Brandon, with all his bluster and manufactured importance, simply didn't exist. This wasn't merely ignoring. It was a profound, almost spiritual indifference that drove Brandon to the brink. His friends, sensing his unease, would egg him on. "He's disrespecting you, bro." They'd whisper their words like gasoline on Brandon's already raging fire of insecurity. He had to reassert his dominance, and soon, the tension escalated to a point where the air around them felt thick, charged with unspoken conflict. One afternoon, Brandon spotted Elijah at his locker, calmly organizing his books. This was it. A direct confrontation. No accidental bumps, no whispered jokes. This was face-to-face where Brandon expected to see the flicker of hesitation, the darting eyes, the subtle sign of fear that always materialized in his victims. He swaggered over his usual entourage, trailing him like loyal hounds. "Hey, Hayes," Brandon drawled, leaning against the adjacent locker blocking Elijah's path. "Heard you're a little too big for your britches around here." Elijah, without rushing, without a hint of anger, smoothly closed his locker. He turned slowly to face Brandon, his eyes locking onto his for just a second. The look was empty, cold, but not fearful. It was like looking into a void, a bottomless well that reflected nothing of Brandon's perceived power. A slight shiver, unbidden and unwelcome, ran down Brandon's spine. It passed quickly, a momentary glitch in his otherwise flawless self-perception. But it was real. He couldn't explain why, but in that fleeting second, he felt a strange sense of vulnerability. It was as if he, the hunter, had suddenly become the hunted, caught in a silent, chilling gaze that stripped him of his usual bravado. Elijah, without a word, simply sidestepped Brandon. His movement fluid, his presence unwavering. He walked away, as if the conversation had never happened, leaving Brandon standing there, simmering with a mix of anger and a profoundly unsettling sense of loss. He had tried to assert control, and instead, he felt like he had been dismissed, reduced to an irrelevant irritant. The breaking point arrived in the cacophony of the cafeteria. It was lunch, the daily battleground of Sterling Prep's social wars. Brandon, surveying his domain from a crowded table, spotted Elijah. He was sitting alone at a smaller table in the corner, calmly eating his meal, completely absorbed in a book. There were no signs of dissatisfaction, no hesitation, no nervous glances around. This infuriated Brandon. He couldn't stand the sight of Elijah's tranquil composure. He needed to shatter it. He needed to make a spectacle. He needed to remind everyone who was king. Drawing a deep breath, Brandon made a grand entrance, striding confidently through the bustling rows of tables, his friends close behind. He paused directly over Elijah, his shadow falling over the quiet table. "Look at this," Brandon announced, his voice carrying over the din drawing stares. "All alone again. Guess nobody wants to be your friend, huh, Hayes?" A few nervous giggles rippled through the nearby tables, but a hushed silence began to spread a ripple effect of anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. Then, with a deliberate, almost theatrical motion, Brandon leaned down and with a swift, powerful flick of his wrist, he flipped Elijah's lunch tray. Food exploded, a disgusting cascade of mashed potatoes, gravy, and scattered chicken pieces splattering across the table, across Elijah's pristine shirt, and onto the sparkling floor. A collective gasp swept through the cafeteria, followed by an immediate, terrifying silence. Every eye was on Elijah. Every single person held their breath, waiting for the explosion. They expected anger. They expected tears. They expected a breakdown. This was Brandon's masterpiece, his ultimate humiliation. But Elijah didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't even flinch. Slowly, with an unnerving calm, he simply placed his fork down beside the mess. He took a deep, deliberate breath, and then his eyes, still holding that empty, eerie look, slowly rose to meet Brandon's. There was no anger, no fear, no confusion, no signs of being hurt. Just that look, a look that felt like silence itself. A profound, unsettling silence that seemed to swallow all the noise and laughter in the room. And in that moment, a chill colder than any Brandon had ever felt ran down his spine. He couldn't explain why, but he felt like he was the one standing on the edge of danger. It felt like he was no longer the hunter, but had unknowingly stepped into the territory of a wild beast, one whose stillness was more terrifying than any roar. Elijah then, with that same unnerving composure, slowly pushed his chair back, stood up, and without a single backward glance, calmly walked out of the cafeteria, leaving the splattered food, the hushed crowd, and a profoundly shaken Brandon Thorne in his wake. This silence, this complete and utter lack of reaction, didn't feel like surrender. It felt like a warning. And Brandon, deep down, knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. This entire episode wasn't just a physical act. It was a masterclass in the psychology of bullying and the bully's utter reliance on power dynamics. Brandon, like all bullies, thrived on visible reactions. Tears, anger, fear. These were the fuels that kept his fire burning, confirming his perceived dominance. But Elijah, in his absolute stillness, stripped Brandon of his oxygen. It was as if Brandon had flung a rock into a perfectly calm lake, expecting a splash, a ripple, a disturbance. Instead, The rock simply disappeared, leaving the surface untouched, reflecting Brandon's own futile aggression back at him. This was the first significant twist. The bully felt defeated not by a fight, but by the profound absence of one. The greatest defeats we learn are often psychological, not physical. And the arena for this battle was now set. The cafeteria incident, the scattered food, the unsettling silence, it all played on a loop in Brandon Thorne's mind. He'd expected tears, anger, a violent outburst. Instead, he got nothing but that chilling, empty gaze, that silent, profound indifference. It was a reaction so alien to his experience that it had burrowed deep under his skin, planting a seed of unease that began to sprout into genuine fear. What kind of person reacted like that? What kind of person could walk away from such public humiliation with such unnerving calm? Brandon knew one thing for sure: he didn't like it. Not one bit. That evening, as the last rays of twilight painted the opulent dining room of the Hayes residence in shades of gold and deep indigo, Elijah sat across from his father, Silas Hayes. The room itself was a study in controlled luxury. A vast mahogany table gleamed under a crystal chandelier, reflecting the perfectly aligned silver and the crisp white linen. It was a space where every detail was meticulously curated, where conversations were measured, and where power in its truest form was the silent guest at every meal. Silas Hayes was a man who radiated authority not through loudness, but through his sheer, undeniable presence. His black hair, peppered with distinguished gray, framed a face that was unyielding yet intelligent. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, its fabric whispering of expense and precision. When he moved, there was a quiet efficiency. When he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant rumble that commanded attention without ever raising an octave. He was a name of weight, a shadow that those who truly held power knew, but no one dared speak of directly in polite society. In a world where most men fought for control, Silas Hayes simply was control. Elijah, usually composed, found his mind momentarily drifting back to the cafeteria. He watched his father's steady hand as he carved the roast, every movement economical and precise. Silas, ever observant, sensed his son's subtle distraction. Without looking up, without a single wasted word, he simply asked, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Is something wrong, son?" Elijah hesitated, then spoke with his characteristic calm. "Just a few punks at school, father, thinking they can bully others." He had no intention of drawing his father's world into his own. He was Elijah Hayes, not merely Silas Hayes' son. He believed in handling his own battles on his own terms. He truly didn't want to be like his father in that way. Silas Hayes chewed slowly, his gaze remaining on his plate. He continued to eat his silence, stretching, growing heavy, more profound than any spoken word. He was observing, assessing, allowing Elijah's answer to settle into the quiet formality of the room. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up, his dark eyes piercing. The single word was delivered with an unnerving calm: name. Elijah's refusal was immediate, almost automatic. "I can handle it myself, father." It was a declaration of independence, a young man's desire to forge his own path, even if that path was shadowed by a giant. Silas listened, his expression unreadable. Then, to Elijah's surprise, a rare, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of Elijah's inherent strength. But then the smile faded, replaced by a quiet intensity that filled the room. Silas leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone that somehow carried more weight than any shout. "But remember, son," he said, his eyes holding Elijah's, "sometimes an enemy needs a reminder of their place. Not a violent one, not a public one, but a reminder." Analyze this line for a moment. It wasn't a command for violence. It wasn't a direct order to retaliate. It was a philosophical statement, a chillingly profound lesson from a master of unseen power. It spoke of strategy, of psychological warfare, of demonstrating dominance not through brute force, but through an absolute, unshakable projection of control. It was Silas Hayes' version of Sun Tzu's Art of War, winning without fighting simply by being understood. And Elijah, even as he resisted fully embracing his father's world, couldn't deny the cold logic of it. He would never let anyone else dictate his fate. Back at Sterling Prep, the whispers began. They started subtly, a ripple in the fabric of the kingdom. Have you heard about Hayes, Elijah Hayes? The name began to filter through the hallways, carried like a breeze, but carrying the weight of an impending storm. It wasn't the kind of rumor spread by gossiping teens. It was the kind passed by hushed upperclassmen, by nervous whispers from students whose parents operated in the same circles as the legends. Brandon Thorne felt it. The atmosphere around him had shifted. The usual admiring glances from girls, the deference from younger students, the camaraderie from his team, it was all subtly different. There were still smiles, but they felt forced. There were still nods, but they seemed cautious. When he walked by, the whispers no longer stopped. They just grew softer, more frantic. Brandon, who lived and breathed for validation, felt an invisible curtain drawing around him. The fear that Elijah's silence was not an absence of reaction, but a silent, terrifying warning, grew with every whispered syllable. Desperate Brandon grabbed a timid sophomore, pulling him into an empty classroom. "Hayes!" He hissed, his voice tight, with a fear he refused to acknowledge. "Elijah Hayes. Who is he? Who's his father?" The boy, trembling, stammered. Silas Hayes. From Hayes Industries. Everyone says he's powerful. Like really powerful." Brandon released him, the words echoing in his mind. Silas Hayes. A cold dread washed over Brandon. He remembered his own father, the renowned philanthropist and real estate magnate, a man who spoke to governors and senators with casual authority. But there was one name, just one, that his father always spoke of in a hushed, almost reverent tone, always with a subtle furrow in his brow, a strange hesitancy. Silas Hayes. His father had once warned him, "Son, some names you never trifle with. They move in shadows, but their reach is longer than any politician's." The realization hit Brandon with the force of a physical blow. He had messed with the wrong person. He had walked into the territory of a beast whose name alone commanded more fear than any of his petty displays of dominance. Later that day, a small, unassuming card appeared tucked into Brandon's locker. No envelope, no return address. Just a stark, elegant piece of cardstock. On it, in crisp, bold lettering, were just 5 words, "Play with fire, you'll get burned." It wasn't a direct threat. It was a statement of immutable truth delivered with chilling calm. It was a silent, unblinking confirmation that Brandon had ventured too far, and the consequences were now not just possible, but inevitable. This wasn't the kind of message a bully sent. It was the kind a force of nature delivered. It was a subtle yet powerful twist that landed the full crushing weight of the unseen kingdom upon Brandon Thorne. His world, once so predictable and controllable, was about to unravel, not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of an impending storm. And Brandon, for the first time in his life, was utterly and completely afraid. This is the power of reputation. We often think of power in terms of wealth titles or physical strength. But as Silas Hayes demonstrates, true power can be an intangible force. A name that carries such weight, it can shift the very air in a room. It's the lesson that some battles are won before they even begin simply by knowing who you're up against, or more accurately, by your opponent realizing who they're up against. Reputations precede people, and true power commands respect, not just fear. Brandon, in his arrogant blindness, had only seen Elijah Hayes as a black student, an outsider, an easy target. He had utterly failed to see the shadow that stretched behind him. A shadow belonging to an unseen kingdom whose reach was absolute, and now that shadow was coming for him. The elegant card with its chillingly simple message, "Play with fire, you'll get burned," felt less like a piece of paper and more like a brand on Brandon Thorne's skin. He gripped it in his locker, the smooth cardstock somehow feeling both impossibly light and crushingly heavy. His mind raced, replaying the words, the casual terror of them. This wasn't a threat from a rival football team. This was something far deeper, far more terrifying. This was the shadow of Silas Hayes. All through his classes, Brandon couldn't focus. The equations on the board blurred, the teacher's voice became a distant hum. His usual arrogance, His unwavering confidence had been replaced by a gnawing dread. He felt constantly exposed, as if every student who glanced his way knew his secret, knew that the king was suddenly vulnerable, that his crown was slipping. The atmosphere around him at school, once filled with his casual dominance, now felt charged with a subtle yet profound shift. No more easy laughter from his friends, no more sycophantic nods. There were still smiles, yes, but they were strained, their eyes quickly darting away. He was no longer the predator. He was becoming the prey, surrounded by unseen eyes that now looked at him with pity, or worse, with a quiet understanding of his impending downfall. His one overwhelming instinct was to get out of there as quickly as possible to escape the suffocating weight of the realization that Sterling Prep, his kingdom, was no longer safe. As the final bell shrieked a sound that usually signaled freedom for Brandon, it was a prelude to something far more sinister. He practically sprinted out of the building, eager to disappear into the anonymity of the parking lot. But as he reached the main gate, he saw them. 2 men. They weren't flashy no-designer suits or ostentatious jewelry. They were just sharply dressed. And still. One leaned casually against a gleaming black sedan, while the other stood a few paces away, hands clasped behind his back. They weren't ordinary. They exuded an unspoken authority, a quiet menace that made the hairs on Brandon's neck stand on end. He knew with a horrifying certainty that these weren't random men. They were here for him. They were Hayes's people. A cold wave of terror washed over Brandon. He tried to walk past, to pretend he hadn't seen them, but the man by the car straightened his gaze, direct and unwavering. "Mr. Thorne." His voice was deep, unhurried, a smooth rumble that needed no threat. It was simply a statement, a formal invitation that was undeniably in order. Whether Brandon agreed or not didn't matter. He was paralyzed. He who had always given orders was now utterly powerless, receiving one he could not refuse. He felt like a puppet, his strings being pulled by an invisible force. The walk to the back parking lot, where a more discreet black SUV waited, felt distant, like it was happening in a fog. Every step was heavy, his heart hammering against his ribs. The men didn't touch him, didn't speak. Their very presence, their silent escort, was enough. And then he saw him. Elijah Hayes. He was standing by the SUV, hands in his coat pockets, his gaze as calm and collected as it had been that day in the cafeteria. There was no sign of anger, no sign of aggression, no hint of a desire for revenge. But that Brandon realized with a sickening jolt was what was most frightening. Someone who is about to take revenge will lose control, will betray their emotions. But someone who has complete control doesn't need to do anything. Their power is inherent, undeniable. Elijah's stillness, his quiet confidence, was a weapon far more potent than any physical threat. Elijah's voice, when it finally came, was soft, almost a whisper, yet it cut through Brandon's fear like a laser. "Do you think I'm weak, Brandon?" Brandon's throat was dry. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just shook his head, a pathetic, desperate gesture. Elijah took a slow step closer, his eyes never leaving Brandon's, those same empty, eerie eyes that had haunted his nightmares. He leaned in just slightly, his breath ghosting across Brandon's ear. The words were delivered with a chilling intimacy that only amplified their terror. "I don't need to touch you, but if I wanted to, Brandon, your life would change forever. In a much deeper, permanent, irreparable way." Brandon's back was soaked with sweat. This wasn't an ordinary threat. It wasn't about getting beaten up or even expelled. This was about something fundamental, something about the very fabric of his existence. Elijah stepped back, his expression unchanged, leaving Brandon to grapple with the full weight of the message. It was crystal clear. Brandon had lost. There was nothing he could do but stand there paralyzed and realize it. His carefully constructed world, built on fragile perceptions of power, was crumbling around him. But the night had one more cruel twist in store. After the silent ride home, after he'd stumbled through his front door, his mind reeling, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He opened the message and his blood ran cold. The words on the screen, stark and unwavering, were, "Tell your dad to watch out for his work. Accidents can happen." No, this couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. Brandon's father, the powerful businessman with connections to the mayor, a man who seemed utterly invulnerable, was now a target. Brandon had always believed that his father's influence would protect him, that it was a shield against any consequence. Now his father's very safety was the leverage, and the chilling realization hit him. Elijah didn't need to joke around. Elijah didn't need to send empty threats, because if he wanted to, this message wasn't a warning. It was a truth waiting to happen. It was the ultimate inescapable consequence of messing with the wrong person. This is the psychological terror in its purest form. The implied threat is far more potent than any explicit one, because it forces the victim to fill in the blanks with their own worst fears. Brandon's world of tangible power, money, social standing, his football glory, was utterly undermined by an intangible force, a quiet, pervasive threat that he couldn't fight, couldn't reason with, and couldn't escape. His father's empire, once his greatest source of security, was now his greatest vulnerability. The greatest defeats we learn are often those that leave no visible marks, only the deep scarring wounds of the mind. And for Brandon Thorne, the king without a crown, the unraveling had just truly begun. The text message, stark and chilling. Tell your dad to watch out for his work. Accidents can happen. Burned into Brandon Thorne's mind more fiercely than any physical blow ever could. He stared at the screen, his hand trembling. No, this couldn't be real. This was the stuff of movies, of whispered legends, not his perfectly insulated, privileged life. His father, the esteemed philanthropist, the real estate magnate, with his picture in society columns and his phone number on the mayor's speed dial. He was untouchable, and yet the words sat there unwavering, carrying the undeniable weight of Silas Hayes. His mind raced a frantic hamster on a wheel of dread. Should he tell his father? The thought alone sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. To admit his monumental mistake, to confess that his childish bullying had somehow invited this chilling shadow into their lives, to admit that he, Brandon Thorne, the king of Sterling Prep, had utterly, spectacularly lost. The humiliation was unbearable, almost as unbearable as the thought of what an accident might mean for his father. He'd always relied on his father's power as an impenetrable shield. Now that very power was the leverage being used against him. This wasn't just about his pride, it was about his family's safety, and he was the one who had recklessly, foolishly put it at risk. The silent message from Elijah was no longer about physical threats. It was about something far more insidious, something that could unravel his entire family's legacy strand by terrifying strand. From that day forward, Brandon Thorne was no longer himself. The transformation was unsettlingly profound. He was just a shadow, a hollowed-out replica of the arrogant king he once was. He still attended school, his physical body present in the marble halls, but something inside him had broken. He didn't smile. The easy, self-satisfied grin was gone, replaced by a permanent haunted pallor. He didn't talk much, his boisterous confidence replaced by a strained silence. He didn't look for someone to pick on. The hunger for control, the need to assert dominance had been utterly extinguished, replaced by a consuming terror that left no room for anything else. His former friends, once fiercely loyal, now kept their distance. The pack instinct, which had once drawn them to Brandon's power, now repelled them from his fear. They whispered about him, yes, but not with admiration. Their glances were a mix of morbid curiosity and thinly veiled contempt. He was no longer the leader. He was a pariah, a living cautionary tale. The unspoken question in their eyes was clear. What did you do? Brandon, who had always reveled in the spotlight, now found himself utterly alone, isolated by the very fear he himself had once wielded against others. For the first time in his life, Brandon realized that real fear didn't come from punches or shouted threats. It came from silence. It came from what you didn't know, from the unknown consequences lurking just beyond your sight. He couldn't fight what he couldn't see, couldn't reason with a power that operated in the shadows. He avoided Elijah like the plague, feeling suffocated if they were in the same room, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like he was constantly being watched, not by Elijah directly, but by the unseen forces that Elijah through his father commanded. The nightmares became his constant companions. He would wake in a cold sweat, gasping for air, from dreams where he was standing in a dark, suffocating room with no one around, only whispers echoing in the darkness. "Do you think I'm weak?" Elijah's calm voice, replaying that chilling question, twisting the knife of his guilt and terror deeper. He was trapped not by physical bars, but by the invisible chains of his own making, forged from his arrogance, and forged by the unseen power of Silas Hayes. And Elijah. He continued to move through Sterling Prep with the same quiet confidence, the same serene indifference. He didn't text Brandon again. He didn't seek him out. He didn't even look at him for more than a second if their paths crossed. Elijah didn't need to do anything. The fear now lived inside Brandon, festering, growing, consuming him from within. This was the cruelest twist of all. Brandon's punishment wasn't inflicted by Elijah, but by his own mind, by the seeds of terror planted by a single quiet encounter. This section, my friends, is a profound lesson in the psychological impact of fear. It shows us how the bully's own mind can become their most inescapable prison. Brandon's former kingdom, built on the fragile foundation of his perceived dominance, was a house of cards easily toppled once its foundation was shaken. He had spent his life projecting strength, but when faced with true unyielding power, his facade crumbled, revealing the terrified, insecure boy beneath. The greatest wounds are often invisible, and the greatest punishments are sometimes self-inflicted, born from the terror of what might happen, rather than what actually does. Brandon Thorne, the king of Sterling Prep, was undone not by a physical battle, but by a chilling realization, by the silent, relentless echoes of fear that now followed him everywhere. And as we continue our journey, we will witness the ultimate silent victory, a final confrontation that will forever etch this lesson into Brandon's very being, and perhaps into yours as well. The transformation in Brandon Thorne was complete, utterly devastating. He was no longer the arrogant king of Sterling Prep. He was a haunted prisoner within his own mind, his freedom stolen by the relentless echoes of fear. The silence, the invisible power that Elijah Hayes wielded, had become his constant tormentor. He moved through the school like a ghost, his once vibrant presence replaced by a hollow shell. The weight of the unspoken threat against his father, the knowledge of the accidents that could happen, pressed down on him, suffocating him. He was losing sleep, losing weight, losing his grip on the privileged reality he had always taken for granted. The school's social landscape had undergone a profound, almost imperceptible shift. When Elijah Hayes entered a room, the air subtly changed. No one dared to look him in the eye for too long now. It wasn't the kind of fear Brandon once spread, a fear built on overt force, on bullying and public humiliation. No, this was a subtler, far more dangerous fear. It was the fear of those who don't need to prove their power because everyone in the room instinctively knows they have it. It was a respect born not of aggression, but of an absolute, chilling understanding of consequences. Where Brandon's power was a loud, flimsy banner, Elijah's was an invisible, unbreakable shield. And Elijah, he remained utterly unchanged. His calm demeanor was unwavering. He never spoke unless necessary, never sought attention, never took pleasure in Brandon's public downfall. He just continued living his life quietly, confidently, unburdened by the drama he had so effortlessly orchestrated. He was an embodiment of the principle that true power isn't about imposing your will. It's about creating an understanding that your will cannot be challenged. Brandon no longer dared to look Elijah in the eye, no longer dared to enter the same room as him without feeling a suffocating dread. His former friends steered clear, their whispers now directed at Brandon, a stark contrast to their previous adulation. The king had not just lost his crown, he had lost his kingdom and the respect of his subjects. The final understanding was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, chilling moment of inescapable truth. It happened late one afternoon. Brandon, consumed by his mounting dread, had stayed late, hoping to avoid any chance encounters, yearning for the false security of his home. He practically ran through the near-empty hallways, his footsteps echoing his own frantic heartbeat. His only thought was to get home as fast as possible to escape the suffocating walls of Sterling Prep, which had become his personal prison. But as he reached the main parking lot, he saw him. Elijah Hayes. He was standing there, not touching Brandon's car, not in an intimidating pose. He was simply waiting, leaning casually against a lamppost, the fading sunlight casting a long, silent shadow behind him. He wasn't overtly threatening. He was simply present, and that presence was enough. Brandon froze, his breath hitched in his throat. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. He was paralyzed, caught in the invisible web of fear he himself had helped weave. Elijah slowly pushed off the lamppost and began to walk towards him. Each step was calm, deliberate, and for Brandon each second stretched out like a century, a terrifying countdown to an inevitable reckoning. Elijah stopped a few feet from Brandon, his eyes, those calm, empty, unnerving eyes fixed on him. And then he spoke, his voice low, gentle, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. Just 5 words, the very same words he had whispered into Brandon's ear what felt like a lifetime ago. "Do you understand now?" Brandon couldn't speak. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His eyes, wide and terrified, were locked on Elijah's. He didn't need to answer. Elijah knew. Brandon understood. He had truly, deeply understood. He understood that he had lost everything. He understood that his power was a sham, his influence a joke. He understood that true fear resided in the unseen, in the implied, in the knowledge that someone held absolute control over your world, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing you could do about it. And that, my friends, was the scariest thing of all. Elijah turned just as calmly as he had arrived and walked away, leaving Brandon standing alone in the vast empty parking lot, a broken figure consumed by an unshakable dread. Elijah didn't need to do anything more. He had won. He had etched an everlasting, indelible mark on Brandon's life, a silent victory that was far more crushing than any punch or public humiliation. This is the ultimate chilling plot twist. The battle was won, not with a fist, not with a shout, but with the profound, terrifying realization that true power doesn't come from external threats. It comes from absolute control, from a silent, unwavering understanding that renders an opponent utterly powerless. Brandon Thorne, the King of Sterling. Prep had once been the strongest person in school, the one no one dared to oppose. But just after one mistake, one arrogant act of prejudice, he lost everything. Not because he was defeated in a fight, but because he had challenged the wrong person. A person who understood that the most powerful lessons are those learned without words, etched into the very fabric of one's being, leaving a silent, permanent scar. And that, my friends, is the true meaning of a silent victory. And so we come to the end of Brandon Thorne's reign, and the quiet, undeniable triumph of Elijah Hayes. We've witnessed a kingdom crumble, not under the weight of a direct assault, but from the insidious, psychological warfare of an unseen force. Brandon, the self-proclaimed king, met his match in Elijah, a young man who wielded not brute strength, but absolute control, a chilling calm, and the terrifying unspoken power of a name that echoed in the shadows. Elijah didn't need to lift a finger. He didn't need to hit Brandon. He didn't even need to shout a single threat. He simply needed Brandon to understand deeply and irrevocably that he had lost. This story, dear listeners, is a testament to a profound truth. True power doesn't come from domination. It comes from control. It's not about how loud you can shout, or how much muscle you can flex, or even how many people you can intimidate. True power is when others understand on their own that they shouldn't challenge you. There's no need to fight, no need to prove anything. Just be there, and they will back down. Brandon Thorne, once the strongest person in school, the one no one dared to oppose, realized that true power doesn't come from threats. It comes from absolute control. And Elijah Hayes, the unassuming newcomer, was the one who controlled everything. Now perhaps you, like Brandon, have found yourself in a position of perceived power, operating under the false assumption that external displays are enough. Or more likely, you've been on the receiving end of someone else's arrogance, their prejudice, their baseless attacks, feeling powerless and unheard. This story isn't just about a schoolyard bully and a tech mogul's son. It's about the unseen forces that shape our lives, the quiet battles fought in the mind, and the profound realization that the greatest victories are often won without a single visible blow. In a world that often celebrates aggression and outward displays of strength, Elijah's story offers a powerful counter-narrative. It reminds us that strategy, resilience, and an unwavering inner calm can be far more potent than any physical might. Think about it in your own life. How many times have you been provoked, pushed, or belittled? How often have you felt the urge to react, to shout back, to fight fire with fire? This story invites you to consider a different path. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Sometimes, by refusing to engage on their terms, by maintaining your composure, you allow your opponent to unravel themselves to self-destruct on the fuel of their own frustration. For our Black listeners, for those who have faced prejudice, who have been made to feel like outsiders, or who have been deeply hurt by the casual cruelty of others, Elijah's journey offers a unique form of inspiration. He is a testament to the power of quiet strength in the face of blatant disrespect. It's a reminder that resisting oppression doesn't always mean overt confrontation. Sometimes it means cultivating an inner fortitude, a strategic resilience, and an understanding of your own inherent worth that the oppressor cannot comprehend and therefore cannot defeat. It's about standing firm, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually in the face of adversity. It's about finding your own unseen power, not the power of a criminal underworld, but the power of self-knowledge, inner peace, and unshakable boundaries. Your greatest weapon can often be your mind, your resolve, and your unwavering belief in your own truth. This story should serve as a beacon for anyone who has ever felt diminished, wronged, or who simply yearns to overcome the adversities of life. It teaches us that the path to victory isn't always the loudest, the most obvious, or the most violent. Sometimes it's the quietest, the most strategic, and the one built on an unshakable sense of self. It's about understanding that true security comes from internal strength, not external control, and that the deepest wounds are often invisible, etched into the very fabric of one's being. So what do you think about how Elijah dealt with Brandon? Do you believe that silence and invisible power are stronger than violence? Was Brandon's ultimate fate deserved? I want to hear your thoughts, your experiences, and your reflections on this story. Leave your insights and comments below. If you found value in this story, if it resonated with you, if it sparked a new way of thinking, then don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you won't miss out on more exciting content designed to inspire, motivate, and perhaps even offer a new perspective on the challenges you face in life. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next story.